folks, I'm Tim Freitas with the Garden of English, and this week we're going to talk about definitions of those key rhetorical players that typically show up in Soapstone or Space Cat or any of those acronyms alike. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we can use the ideas from last week, this idea that rhetoric is always something that involves the concrete and the abstract, and we're going to try to tie that into those major players like I just mentioned. We're going to talk about context, exigence, speaker, audience, and we'll probably try to throw a purpose in there too. But if we can conceptualize that rhetoric is always something concrete and abstract, it's going to actually help us be more effective in understanding these parts, and it might even help our students ask the right questions to figure out the information that they need to fill that in. Now, before I get into this though, I want to just think about how when we get textbooks, we often read essays that are in them. Before we read them, or at least before my students read them, I typically have them read the italics that show up before the piece that really talk about the context and the exigence and even the speaker and the purpose at times. Now, it would be really nice if in our lives people could walk around with those italics a lot too. I mean, just imagine we could see somebody and right floating above their head or to the side of their head, they would see something a lot like this. But it just so happens that doesn't happen in life, and it doesn't really happen when these rhetorical elements that we give kids to read are actually delivered. So what we want to do is we want to teach kids to not have to rely on the italics and actually be able to figure this stuff out themselves. So when I give my students papers to read or things to read, except for when I first start rhetoric, I try not to give them any of that italic for information about the speaker or the audience or the context, because I want to teach them to actually read in the text to figure out as much of that as they actually can. And if we take these ideas of rhetoric being something concrete and abstract, we can actually work to give kids questions that they have to answer and identify with text in the reading that can help them work through those things. So I'm going to go through now what my questions are and what's going to happen at that point. Excuse me. What's going to happen at that point is we're going to try to say, how does this relate to the concrete and the abstract? Now, I'm going to save context and exigence for last, although I know that there has been kind of a debate about that and how that looks with the concrete and the abstract, but I assure you that we can match it right on up. But let's actually start with speaker. So when my students are reading anything and they have to identify elements of the speaker, they want to separate their questions into the concrete question and the abstract questions. So the first questions my kids have to look for when I first start teaching rhetoric is, who is the speaker? And that is, who is literally talking, or what entity is literally talking, because sometimes it might be Honda producing a commercial, sometimes it might be McDonald's producing a commercial, sometimes it might be Anheuser-Busch producing a commercial, I don't know, or it could actually be a person, or sometimes it's a little bit of a pairing of both. If LeBron has a milk mustache, are we talking about the Dairy Farmers Association of America, or are we talking about LeBron? Maybe both. But my kids are going to have to prove who the concrete speaker is, what entity has some sort of identity that is trying to convey a claim. So when my kids are looking for speaker, the first question they're actually trying to answer is this: who is literally speaking? Once they can find that, they're going to move on to the next question, which is where we start getting into our critical thought, which is therefore the abstract element of rhetoric. So concretely, who is literally speaking? But now we want to know abstractly who is speaking. So they're going to ask questions such as this: what character qualities does this speaker present or represent? What does this speaker value as a person? And then, of course, we're also going to say, where does this speaker's authority come from? And those three questions they have to find answers for in the text. And if they can answer some of them or all of them, we know that they're then therefore looking for the abstract qualities of the speaker. Once they take care of that, though, we can just move on to audience, and we can split that also into the concrete and the abstract. And so for the audience, the first question that they're going to ask is, who is literally listening? Who is it that's supposed to hear this in person? And then what they're going to do is they're going to ask for, and that will take care of the concrete part, and then what they're going to do is they're going to ask for the abstract. And so the questions that they're going to answer for the abstract is, what are the audience's collective character qualities? Or if it's singular, what are the character qualities of the person who is listening? We also want to think about what type of person or people make up this audience? And so those are the questions that my kids are going to be answering there. So the concrete question that they have to answer is, who's listening? Who's actually there? And then it's, who are they as people and what are their common character qualities? Now, if this is done right, typically you're going to see that the character qualities that the speaker has are typically in some way related to the character qualities of the audience, and that's what we do want to see. Unless it's a place where it's a little bit more contentious and there's a debate going on, but even then the kids will be able to see, oh my word, the character qualities of the audience seem to be a little bit opposite of the character qualities of the speaker, or the values of the audience seem to be different than the values of the speaker. And because of that, the kids will say, oh, this is going to be a much more persuasive type of piece. And that's a great way to analyze a piece like that, because it's how does the speaker then bring the audience into his side when there might be some contention there. So after they take care of audience, though, they are going to look at the subject in terms of the concrete and the abstract. For example, when they're looking for the concrete subject, I have them answer this question: what is the speaker actually talking about? Literally, like if I read this, I think about the Gettysburg Address, and of course, you know, my kids are going to be like, oh, he's talking about the Civil War and fighting for the country. And I'm like, no, right now, let's just talk about the concrete moment here. It's a graveyard. He's honoring the dead. That's what's going on here. And that's going to be the concrete element there that will help them then look for the abstract parts of the subject. And for that, what I do is I talk to the kids about universal ideas. But the question that they have to actually answer when trying to find abstract elements of subject in what they read is this: what underlying ideas that may not be explicit actually exist within the piece? And what I do is I have a list that was given to me by John Williamson that I've since added to. And if you don't know John, you should know John. He's quite incredible. That I'll try to remember to put in the comments below, right, the video, of 100 universal ideas. And now I think I'm up to like 105 or 106. And I tell the kids, when you read this piece, you want to try to say, what ideas does this piece relate to? And if we're reading the Gettysburg Address, then you're going to see things like freedom and hope and honor and reverence. And those are parts of the subject. Now, what's interesting is that if I do this and I have the kids look for the concrete and the abstract in terms of speaker and audience and subject, they're going to see that a lot of these abstract elements seem to overlap. So the kids will say, oh, Abraham Lincoln seems to really value the sacrifice of the people that died on the battlefield of Gettysburg. And sure enough, when the kids get to the subject of the speech and they have to go to the abstract moment, they're going to be like, wow, sacrifice is in there. And the audience also seems to value sacrifice. And I'm like, great, that's why we have a rhetorical triangle, because the speaker, the audience, and the subject all do indeed relate to sacrifice in and of itself. So that's how we use the concrete and the abstract to kind of navigate through the speaker and the audience and the subject as well. Now, for the end of this, though, I do want to talk about context and exigence, because there was a little bit of lack of clarity, I guess, that I noticed on the on one particular website that I visit, where teachers often discuss things with one another. And the best way for me to put this is that the context should be more abstract in nature, and the exigence should be more concrete in nature. And the easiest example that I have for this is prom season. If the context of something is prom season, that's not necessarily the exigence, because the exigence is going to be what actually prompts me to ask somebody to go to prom. So if my context is prom season, it's a little bit more abstract, but the exigence would be, I think he or she is a fly honey, and I'm going to ask him or her to prom because it's in the right context, and now I know that I want to score that date to prom. If I were to go something a little more academic, right, and we think about the Gettysburg Address, we know that there was a Civil War, the Civil War tensions that were going on, and then what actually moved Abraham Lincoln to speak at the Gettysburg Address is that they were actually honoring and commemorating a graveyard. So because of that, I could say, all right, contextually, we've got this greater universal problem within America, and then what explicitly moved him to speak, we gave him that window of opportunity, because that's what really exigence is, what's moving that person to speak at that moment. It's going to be he was invited to speak as they dedicated a graveyard. So even the concrete and the abstract can tie right in with exigence and context as well. So what happens here is if I were to ask questions for the context, I would have my kids answering in the text, okay, when you read, what major historical events are happening during the time period or are seemingly going on in a broader sense? And then for exigence, I'm going to ask my kids to answer this more concrete question, what is something along the lines of what literally moves the speaker to speak when he or she does. The last thing that I just want to comment on real quick, my definition for purpose is what the audience is supposed to understand and do after experiencing the discourse. And right there you can see the concrete and abstract in the definitions. What the audience is supposed to understand, that's abstraction. What should the audience do? That's going to be much more concrete. And so therefore, this is why I used my definition for rhetoric as, or why I give my definition of rhetoric this idea of using language to convey meaning between that concrete and abstract, because it gives the kids a framework to actually know that when they look at anything, it's got to have a concrete element and an abstract element. And then when they write, they know that they will always have to pinpoint something concrete that conveys something abstract. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about that or you want me to clarify anything, as always, please leave a comment down below and I'm happy to do it. I also want to encourage you to either like or share things of that nature. Please consider sponsoring us on Patreon. As I always say, $1 helps, especially a dad of 5. But don't worry, if you don't want to, you don't have to, because as I say every week, these videos are still free. So we hope you enjoyed our time here today, and we'll come back probably in a week or two, and we'll actually talk about how do we annotate for rhetorical analysis, thinking about the what and the why. That's the concrete and the abstract. And then we'll get into thesis statements, paragraphing, and eventually even writing conclusions. We can do that too. So you all have a great, beautiful week.